Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the European Defence and Security Summit. Please come in and take your seats and settle down. We'll get going with our next panel, which is going to be a discussion with quite a punchy title this morning, which is on war economy. Is it possible and or necessary? A big welcome to everybody who's joining us online as well. It's great that you're here. Welcome to everyone in the room. A packed room for these discussions today. I think we can see how important the topics that we're talking through are. My name is Jack Parrock. I'm a Brussels-based news correspondent and presenter and writer working across a number of broadcasters and newspapers. And I'm delighted to have been invited to moderate this discussion this morning. Now, to get into this, we have an esteemed set of panelists. The former president of Finland, Sauli Niinistö, it's wonderful that you're here with us. James Apatharai, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid and Cyber at NATO and was NATO Secretary General, Special Representative for the Caucasus and Central Asia, among a number of other esteemed roles. We also have Camille, who is a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And we have, joining us online as well, we have Roberto Cingolani, who is the CEO of Leonardo. I hope that we'll be able to see you on the screen, Roberto. Perhaps not yet, but he will be there. I'm absolutely certain of it. And last but not least, we have Eirik Lie, who is the president of Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace, the Norwegian defence company. This is a great panel to talk about, as I said, quite a punchy subject. The first thing I'd like to do before I speak to our panelists is to get a bit of reaction to this from the audience and have a bit of hands up on a couple of questions. Firstly, the question is, do we think a war economy, we'll talk about Europe, is possible? Hands in the air if you think it's possible. 1 or 2, 3, maybe 4. Is it necessary in the current climate? Yeah, more there. Okay, so let's see how we get into this and see what... I think that was what we were expecting, broadly. But this all sort of started with President Macron. A few other senior European officials have talked about it. He talked quite prominently about war economy mode for defense companies in January. He actually doubled down a bit on it this week. I'll start with you, President Niinistö. This is quite a difficult thing to talk about, but it also leads us into a question about Europe's preparedness. In the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the military support that Europe has had to do, I wonder if we can get an assessment, your assessment, of how prepared Europe is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I have to cause a disappointment because I would rather talk about security economy than war economy. What I mean by this is that we need ordinary people to come on board when we develop preparedness. And if you think about security, isn't it the most important value an individual or a family can have? The welfare of today, the plans for the future, all depends on whether you're secured or not, whether peace prevails or not. So that's why I would like to talk more about security economy. Then to another issue. Some 10 years ago, I was almost shocked after listening to Putin's yearly speech in Valdai. Namely, he said that the Western people are spoiled with their lifestyle, with their values, which all he undermined, and stating that thus the West is weak. And the combination of an aggressive Russia and Russia's understanding that, or opinion that the West is weak, that kind of combination is quite dangerous. So I want to talk about mindset. Mindset of society's mindset of people, because that actually also dominates the political decisions of governments and the EU. What we can do is depending on which kind of mindset people have. If it's very common, if most of people think that, yes, most important for me is that peace prevails, that security is there. So we wouldn't have any problem, because that means that everybody feels that I am protecting myself when my government increases budget for military purposes or preparedness. Not only Russia and Putin, we face a lot of different kind of challenges, man-made or natural. Let's take example of pandemic or something which is totally unknown still. Even that is possible. So far, I guess we have succeeded in our reactive operations from the start in Ukraine, in pandemic, COVID, even though we were not prepared. But what we learn is that we have to be prepared also for something unknown. What we could do more to get prepared. The governments just making decisions can't do it alone, neither even the EU not. But if the mindset is amongst people in place, that they understand that nobody is actually taking anything away from them, but they are giving security, their primary value is strengthened. That's another issue. We could a lot use also the civil society. In civil protection, we have a lot of voluntaries, good examples around Europe. Also in military civil cooperation, we have reservists with their organizations in some countries very active, taking part to ensure that they can live in secure and peace. One element is public-private partnership, which I think has to raise on new level, because the threats, lack of security, actually have united the interest of public sector and private sector, and doing together with the private sector with its technology and public sector with its intelligence. I think we should create more trust amongst us and go a lot more open ways of cooperating. To end up, I quote a probe from Stalin. He namely said that it was an advice for one who uses bayonet. If you touch soft, then push. If you touch steel, then withdraw. And let's make ourselves steel. Thank you.
Thank you, President Niinistö. Interesting comments to start with. But I wonder if we can come down to you, James, and talk about what the economic situation is and how it affects the work that happens inside NATO as an alliance. And when a president like the French president talks about war economy mode, what happens then in the sort of internals of NATO headquarters?
Yeah, great question. And I think the first thing to say from a NATO point of view is we're quite confident in our ability to defend all allies now and every inch of NATO territory, but we also have to recognize, and we do, that the Russians are substantially ramping up their capability to produce, and I wrote down some numbers. So basically, I think most people think about 30% plus of the Russian GDP is now being put into defense, compared to an average of around 2% for us. So that's a big difference. Their supply chains have secured the inputs they need. They are evading sanctions relatively effectively. Their factories are running around the clock, literally around the clock, and have been nationalized in many cases. I've seen estimates that 2.5% of their population is now working in the military-industrial complex. They can produce 3 times the amount today of artillery shells that Europe and the United States can produce together on an annual basis. And I've got a lot more numbers, but that sort of shows you what we're talking about in terms of industrial capability, or at least contracts and production. So President Macron, I think, was reflecting a very widespread concern amongst many allies that, okay, we had many years where we could cash in on the peace dividend, and that time has come to an end now. And we have to do 2 things. We have to continue to provide the Ukrainians everything they need, and they need a lot all the time. But we also need to replenish our own stockpiles, and these 2 things are, of course, very related. So what are we doing about it? And I think it's not just President Macron, whether or not you use the words war economy, there's a clear understanding that we have to do things differently. So what are we doing? First, all allies are increasing defense spending. Compared to what we were projecting 10 years ago, I think we're talking about 400 billion more by next year. 20 allies are at least at 2%. Some are way above it. Poland's heading towards 4%. So there's way more money. We are working with industry to improve predictability, so long-term contracts, and there's a lot of contracts being signed. Third, NATO is aggregating demand, so we're pooling allies together to buy things together. So we get a better price, and one example is that NATO helped organize a contract for 1,000 Patriot missiles to be purchased together by 4 NATO countries. We've raised our capability targets for all allies, so allies have a higher threshold to meet. We're also working on innovation. The president mentioned this as well. Much stronger public-private partnership, accessing dual-use technologies. We have an initiative called Diana, which is a bit like NATO's DARPA. We have an innovation fund, which is at €1 billion, deep tech. We're hoping to raise that with 2 or 3 new countries joining, up to 1.5 billion. That will crowd in, according to our estimates, another 15 to 30 euros for every euro we invest. So once we're up at 30 to 45 billion of market money, then you're starting to have an effect. And we're communicating better. And this panel is part of that. We need to help Europeans, Canadians, and everyone else in NATO understand that now we have to do things differently, and it's going to cost. Having Russia as a neighbor costs. But you know, I was in a bakery a couple of days ago and was chatting with the woman who worked there, and she asked where I worked, and I said, NATO. And I've lived here a long time, but I have not heard someone say this. She kind of grabbed my arm and said, defend us because we're afraid. Like even here, people are concerned. So I think there's a very different mindset. I also really feel it from the private sector. 4 years ago, a lot of dual-use companies, tech firms, leaned away from NATO and from defense. Now they're knocking at our door because they understand that they need defense to preserve our values and our shared security. So I think that the climate is much better in terms of public understanding, in terms of the way we're organizing ourselves, in terms of the money available, to be able to ramp up to a much, much more substantial economy.
Thanks so much for your opening insights there, James. Camille, I think you're a good person to perhaps explain to us, and you can talk about some of the stats there that we heard from James related to the Russians and to our own. What is a war economy, essentially? That's a useful thing for us to sort of have put in stone, perhaps.
First of all, war economy is not where Europe is. Whatever we say, this is another tool where we are. Might be where Russia is. So is it something that we should be hoping for ourselves? I'm not sure. But we certainly need to put our actions where our words are. Indeed, President Macron mentioned the war economy for the first time in June 22. Some of you were in the room, some of us were in the room when he said that. That's about 2 years ago. So I'm not sure we have moved at pace from that high-level type of high-level political statement to the reality. So there we are in a moment, and that comes with a few things, which is moving on the money. James rightfully described the sort of good news story of NATO countries that are investing more, European countries that are investing more into defense, but it's not true for all of them, and it has been slow in terms of the direction of travel. There are essentially three groups of countries in that. I mean, those that are way ahead and moving faster, those that are roughly at 2% and thinking they are going to get away with being roughly at 2%, and those who are way behind and make promises over the horizon, hoping that maybe when the horizon comes, the need is no longer there. So that's a problem. But I really like President Niinistő's point about the security economy, because I don't think our message to the European public should be this is about warfare versus welfare, because in a way it is about protecting our model, it is about protecting our society and the way we operate. So the point is not in saying we're going to starve you like Russians in order to beat the Russians. That is not an attractive model. Nevertheless, I would argue that collectively, as Europeans, we do have the means, the capabilities and the money to do so if we are serious and steady over time. And that is where a war economy mindset is extremely useful, because this is where it sort of helps focus the minds. And there, what I sometimes see is, again, this sort of slow move. I would argue that since the February 22, when it comes to these decisions, which are indeed different from the decisions about defense of Europe, we've been somewhere between 6 and 12 months behind the curve. So we start talking about something, and then it takes 6 months to make the decision and 6 months to implement it. When I would have liked to see, and I would continue to like to see, much more deliberate choices to move at pace with what's happening. You know, we could see the situation for air defenses in Ukraine coming 6 months ago. You know, any one of us tracking that challenge was talking about the shortage of air defense capability in Ukraine 6 months ago. How come were the decisions that we now see emerging not coming? Ammunition shortfalls were identified. It took way too long to move at pace on that. Yes, we're coming there, but the next 6 months are going to be tremendously difficult for Ukraine, and we need to focus ourselves. And finally, of course, all of this is about us as well. So in that environment, the issue is to sustain this effort over the long haul. It can't be a bushfire, not only because it's not good for business, I would say it's not the central issue there, but it's not good for our security. We really need to make this effort a sustained policy by the European Union, by the member states, over a decade, to really be steady in this, because we do need to support Ukraine. It's probably going to take longer. We do need to do the boring thing, buy ammunition and spare parts to reconstitute our stocks and assist the Ukrainians. We do need to rebuild conventional capabilities where there are gaps. And finally, we need to prepare for the future. And none of these, you know, in the old days you could choose between those things. We no longer can afford doing this. Spending somewhere between 2 and 3% is probably the order of magnitude that enables to do that. But it needs to, but as long as it is sustained, that's the critical element. There has been too much free riding across Europe for too many years, and that's why we have such a big step to take now.
We're not talking about commandeering private vehicles and the lady in the bakery that was asking you to protect her using her bread to send to the front lines. That's not the war economy we're talking about, exactly. I'm going to try and bring in Roberto Cingolani, who I hope is online for us, is on screen. Yes, there you are. Hello.
Okay. Sorry, guys. So first of all, thank you for allowing me to participate by remote. I am replacing my hip. I had the hip replacement surgery, so my mobility is very bad. So sorry for being far. I was listening at your speech, very interesting. As a CEO of a defense company, I'd like to say that since the end of the Cold War, in Europe, we kind of experienced this sort of a cold peace period in which security has been considered a sort of commodity. People got used to that, but actually, I think such a commodity, security, as an economic value, but also a price. And Europeans should really urge in reconsidering the price of peace. Peace must be defended. This is actually the way we can synthesize. And if we compare what happened in United States and in Europe in 2023, last year, according to the consolidated balance sheets, apparently U.S. Only for procurement, defense procurement, has been investing something like 250 to 300 billions. I mean, these numbers, of course, depend a little bit on the sources, but we are in the range of 250 billions allocated over a dozen of platforms, aircraft, ships, tanks, and so on. Europe was investing in procurement about one half, distributed over approximately 30 different platforms, because every country or member state in Europe likes to have its own aircraft, its own tank, its own armored vehicle. So you understand that the per capita investment or per platform investment doesn't make Europe very effective. And this is not only a matter of money, it's also a matter of fragmentation. And I think we have to consider this very seriously. We will never be a good partner of NATO in the Atlantic Alliance if we will not be reliable and robust enough to guarantee the right support to the global security. Now, the lessons that we learned out of the Ukrainian war were three lessons, to my opinion, were very, very unexpected. The first thing was that a young guy with a mobile phone connected in some way to the Starlink civil satellite networks of Elon Musk and controlling a drone that normally carries cameras, but in that case was carrying maybe half a kilo of C4 dropping on a tank, could destroy a machine which is worth of 20, 30 millions. So digitalization turned out to be quite a defensive toolkit, and never understood this previously. The second lesson was that as soon as the war exploded, this was a peripheral war in the southeast wing of Europe, there was a global insecurity in energy, in food, in cyber, and even for the infrastructures. So apparently, even a peripheral war immediately creates a global insecurity situation. That is a consequence of globalization. And we could handle this, we could experience this with the energy crisis. I was Minister of Energy at that time. Believe me, it was a struggle to get rid of the Russian gas and to give energy security to the country and to the rest of Europe. The third lesson was that no one can make it on its own, especially in Europe. The fragmentation means that the way we could help the Ukrainians was not very effective. We use the same weapon with the same ammunition, 155 millimeters, but the ammunition given by country number one and country number two are different. So even the supply chain and the logistic for the military support was very critical. We didn't have any uniform technology to provide to the Ukrainian armies. Now, I think the future of defense is evolving. The technology is evolving dramatically. We're moving fast towards a sort of interoperable cross-domain scenario where land, air, sea, and space platforms should talk to each other, should be synergistically orchestrated. This means cybersecurity has to become the glue of the new defense paradigm. Electronics has to be kind of uniform through all the platforms, whether they are aircraft or tanks. Should not make the difference. Services, satellites as a services, will become very important because somehow you have to monitor from the top what happens on the ground. In order to do this, for sure we need much stronger digitalization in our defense technology, cloud computing, data analytics, and even space cloud, which is going to be something to be developed soon. Yeah. Cybersecurity in Europe, at least, has to be central and coordinated. By no means we can make interoperable cross-domain defense systems in each country that are not capable to dialogue, to talk to each other. Otherwise, we will be 27 small armies rather than a unified European defense, technically, I mean.
Yeah.
Space, again, has to be central and well coordinated. We didn't succeed very much with our launchers policy, with our satellite policy. We should reconsider all this. Platforms, think to the strategic aircraft,
Roberto.
have to be unified and improved. Yeah?
Yeah, we'll come back onto some of these issues. Perhaps you can carry on. You can carry on there just for a moment on the list of issues that you were saying, but we'll return to them in a moment. So
Sure.
if I can ask you just to wrap up quickly.
Sure. Just closing.
Yeah.
I think all what I said needs industrial synergies that at the moment are very difficult, especially in Europe, because of national interests, of course, that has to be overcome, but also because of rules. I think in a pre-war economy like the one we are, antitrust rules should be released, letting Europe to create much more competitive industrial groups. And I think we should make the move towards a European defense space, which is the only way to be collaborative, reliable, and useful to the NATO alliance. Yeah. That's all.
Thank you so much, Roberto. It's really great to get your insights, and I think we all wish you well for your convalescence from your surgery. We're very grateful that you've joined us here today, despite that. I'm gonna move down to Eirik from Kongsberg Defence and Aerospace. You similarly are a company working in this space. When you hear the word war, the phrase war economy, what does this mean to you? I mean, some people might suggest that a defense company would love the idea that, there's a big press towards creating an economy around what you're doing.
Yeah, no, thank you for that introduction. I think I would not say that we love that term. It's we are used to developing and producing military equipment that is never to be used to secure the peace. So I think now it's changed, and I think we have to realize that we have to, as industry, build within the framework we are in. But I definitely agree with President Niinistö that the security feeling in the public opinion is really important, and we see it. We as a company, we are hiring 500 people each year, and it's getting a, interesting place for people to actually work in, and that shows something to the public. And I think that's one important aspect of it. Seen from my point of view going forward, well, if you look at I think James touched on it. These long-term commitments, it's very important for the industry in order to be successful in supporting nations, EU, in military equipment. If I look back a little bit, I defined 3 phases of how I can define this financial setting with Europe. Before Ukraine, we saw a slightly increase of defense budget, probably based on Camille. And then we had the war breakout, which suddenly increased case by case, to some extent, the financial support to do investment into military equipment. And now we can see that each nations are increasing quite significantly defense budgets. So that's the kind of the framework we need to work in. And obviously, from our point of view, and as a company, we look at these long-term commitments and look at these funding mechanisms in order to invest into our production capacity to increase that. And if we see this long-term commitment in several countries, we can calculate a business case in order to support the production capacity needed. But at the same time, I think we also need to realize that as part of this, we need to innovate. And I think innovation here means several things. One is what type of systems we need. The other one is how to do procurement in collaboration with government to government. It could be with EDF. It could also be ASAP as good examples of that will be a trigger. And so in all, I think the speed of taking actions need to increase. That's kind of the trigger for also as industry. We want this to happen quicker. And with a defense sector since 1990, building down defense capacity and also the speed of how things are developed, we need to step up in better manner in that case.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've been talking about stepping up for a couple of years now, though. This is it, isn't it? It's sort of at what point are we really going to make those steps? And I mean, Finland stepped up. I mean, it joined NATO. It changed its entire security sort of structure because of Russia's invasion in Ukraine. I wonder if you can talk to me, I mean, that's a structural change, but how economically has the defense industry in Finland changed, President Niinistö?
First, I have to say that Finland stood up already
exactly.
decades ago.
Yeah.
So we have all the time kept our conscription, for example, and well, somewhere in, I call it a national memory in backbone, is a warning, even though the relations were quite good with Russia every now and then. But this warning is living, and it came to true after Russia attacked Ukraine. Suddenly Finns changed totally their opinion, and we joined. To economy, what I pointed out is the mindset of ordinary people, that they would understand that, well, we are on a common task here. And that means that, well, you have to understand that securing your values and your family, that is also going to cost something. And I would say that we are now on some 2.3% of our GDP with our military, and keeping that level in spite of the fact that we have quite serious economic problems. But maybe it's due to this national memory that people understand and even accept it.
Yeah.
And acceptance is very important, because we have to all the time keep in mind the rules of democracy here.
And this is when it comes to public perception is huge in this. You know, if you're trying to increase your defense spending, but your health sector is having a trouble, you know, people get upset about it, but they need to be aware and have that perception that it's a necessary.
And it's for them.
Yeah.
That is what has to the message. It's for you.
Yeah. I'm gonna come back to Roberto if he's still with us. Just perhaps to get your insights a little bit about the difference in the sort of economics and the structures in how companies like yours are working differently perhaps in Europe in the context of after Russia's invasion compared to, say, the United States, a NATO ally, but perhaps has a more a different defense structure. Can you talk us through how that works?
Very quickly, it's a twofold answer. On one hand, you have to keep being competitive on the existing platforms like aircraft, satellites, helicopters, whatever you do, kind of hardware. But on the other hand, we urge to have a digital transformation, primarily introducing cybersecurity by design in all the platforms, a lot of AI, because most of the future weapons will be system of systems. Basically, there is a mother or a father unit that controls a swarm of drones that will be somehow intelligently managed. And of course, a dominant role will be played also by the satellites as a service, as I mentioned before, because most of those platforms will be kind of controlled by the top, by the satellites, and we will need real-time scenario analysis, real-time forecast. That means a very heavy high-performance computing capability, or if you want, AI capability, which is introduced in the battlefield or in the complex scenario. This is a radical change in the technology. So still, we continue, unfortunately, to make the standard hardware, the weapon, But we have to add so much intelligence, so much digitalization, that even the workforce and the engineering changed a lot, and this has to be done very fast. We do have a problem now. There is not enough STEM people, so science, technology, engineering, mathematics, young people to be hired because we don't produce enough. So that's another change and another difficulty that we have to face.
And that's across all aspects of the European Union's industry as well. It's not just defence. As we're trying to do a green transition,
Absolutely.
Desperate for people in those areas as well. Yeah, good point.
Absolutely.
I'll come to you, James. Perhaps you can talk us through a little bit about how NATO supports its allies in this area, where that coordination comes, what are the challenges in sort of weighing up the different challenges that each individual member state has to face?
My voice isn't that loud, sorry. So a few thoughts. First is, and I know we've talked a lot about Europe here, but from our perspective, the framework has to be transatlantic. There are a lot of countries that are in both organizations, but just to put it really bluntly, 80% of the defense spending in NATO is non-EU countries, AT. So if we're going to actually improve in this area, we have to do this in a NATO framework, and it benefits everybody. So Roberto's absolutely right that European countries need to do more and are doing so much more together, but we cannot look at this as Europe versus the United States. This is not going to get us anywhere. So I just want to make that point really clearly. Second, what can NATO do? We provide the target, which is 2%, but now 2% as a floor and not as a ceiling. And I come from a country that my friend here kindly didn't point out as being in the third and lowest category of countries that is not actually even achieving the 2%, let alone going towards more. But it is actually an important political benchmark, and all allies need to meet it. I come from the Defense Department of Canada, so I know that if you are well below 2% where we are, you're not just staying where you are, you're rusting out, you're going backwards. So it's a really, really important political target, and it needs to be a floor and not a ceiling. So we have then agreed a defense production action plan at NATO. All allies have agreed to this, and it sets targets, it aggregates demand, it's aimed to stimulate industrial production, and it aims to enhance interoperability and standardization. And I think you've heard a lot of the concerns here. We have to ensure that if we produce one kind of ammunition or one kind of equipment, it actually has to be one kind of ammunition and one kind of equipment. And a German shell has to actually fit in an Italian howitzer, because just because it says 155 on the shell doesn't mean actually it could, because little national modifications were introduced. So we have to stop that. Then we are aiming to replenish stocks and sending clear targets to allies about how to replenish their stocks. Aggregating allies, as I mentioned, to make purchases, to make long-term contracts, and we're trying to establish a new and deeper relationship with industry. So we've set up a Defense Industrial Production Board, meaning all the CEOs are coming together with us, and then we're going to grind through the real issues, hear their concerns, they can hear our concerns, and it'll be a whole different level of cooperation. So hopefully, and we expect that all of this will make a difference. We have a summit in Washington in early July. I can assure you that there will be basically two issues on that agenda: supporting Ukraine and this. This is the political priority across the alliance.
Yeah. Camille.
I wanted to sort of follow up on James. I think that some of the points I very strongly agree with, not surprisingly, having spent a little time at NATO, but including on the fact that NATO targets in particular are really shaping the conversation when it comes to defense, and it is really important that the NATO defense planning process steers that conversation in the right direction, also gives it the right level of urgency. I think one of the issue with NATO targets is that sometimes they were a little over the horizon, and the closer we move them to the, in terms of time frame, the most important it is. Second point I wanted to make, and there I might have a small nuance with James, is on the differences, the US versus Europe when it comes to this. First of all, in my own experience of talking with US companies, US officials, it is not as if those were two completely different words. Yes, the US domestic market is much larger and so on and so forth, but the concept of off-the-shelf is misleading. In the US, you don't have a gigantic Walmart where you can buy planes and missiles. They have to be produced as well. They are competing with other customers as well. So the sort of challenges that we're discussing at great length for Europe exist in the US as well. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because what I found very interesting in still being at NATO in the early days of the Ukraine crisis is that the sort of challenges we're discussing about Europe are exactly the same one. How does my supply chain react to new contracts? How do I meet the demand of multiple customers, including export customers, while trying to meet immediate demands? How do I, and those are literally the same. And sometimes more challenging. Ammunition, for instance, is more challenging in the US because, contrary to a common belief, it is mostly made in sort of small arsenals managed by the army and not with great industrial players. So those are, I think, very interesting points there for the competition. Finally, maybe just one nuance on this 80% debate within NATO. I think it's somewhat misleading in a way because any group with the US in is 80%. So you could say 80% of defense spending at NATO is being done by nuclear weapon states. That's quite difficult for the other 29. Or 80% is made by English-speaking countries. Then Canada is in the right group. So any group with the US is sort of working. But I would argue that the biggest issue is indeed in terms of burden sharing. How do we rebalance that? Yeah. So how do we make sure that the US, and what does that mean for the Europeans? What does that mean for the Europeans to have a full force package? What does that mean for the Europeans to have to be collectively in a situation where the US, putting aside domestic politics, is not necessarily in a position to provide the same degree of commitment to European security than in the past, simply because, for instance, of the challenges in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. I'll come down to you, Eirik, again. Kongsberg, you mentioned a little bit, is expanding rapidly. You're growing. You're in an interesting position within the structures that we're talking about here. Member of NATO, not in the European Union, in the market. I wonder if you can talk about some of the challenges that you're facing in that expansion, or also, some of the requirements on your business, and just how you see that going forward.
Yes, if I start, it's correct that Norway is not part of EU, but part of NATO. But I would also argue that it's important to realize that Norway has always been, especially on defense issues, worked with EU, and we are collaborating with many of the industry partners in Europe or in EU. So I would say that I interpret us as an integrated part of European defense industrial base, which is very important for us. And at the same time, we also have links towards US, which is also really relevant for this cooperation, definitely. And so I think Norway has something to contribute to EU. So it's a two-way factor there. So then, if you look at this from EU side, then we are part of EDF, part of the ACEP program, and there are more things coming up here, which are important for us to be part of. Well, I think I'd like to say that even though outside EU, we as an industry face the same challenges as EU industry, so to speak, is that we're going to support NATO. So it's not a kind of separate thing. We are in the same structure here. Yeah. So I think that's kind of the overarching topic that we need to support together or support NATO together. And this means, collaborating on programs, procurement, maybe pooling procurement. That is an efficient model to work out from.
But you also require stability. This suggestion of, we also heard Roberto touch on this slightly. If we go full war economy, companies like yours have said, right, charge out your production, hit it up as much as you can do. And then 2 years later we go, all right, done, war's over, Russia, that isn't going to work for you, is it?
No, that's why we constantly, and I'm not the only industry leader saying this, that we need long-term perspective. That's important. So if we have that, then it's easy for us to do the investment. Otherwise, we need support from the governments to support in that.
Yeah. Okay, I think we are going to have an opportunity to ask questions in the room if we want. Before we do it, I can see one, I'll come to you. I'm quite interested to see, after I did our little hand-raising experiment at the beginning, whether the room would agree with the need for a new term, as President Niinistö put, of a security economy. Do you think that that's a term that we can work with? Yeah, okay. More people this time. I think we'll probably go with it as well. So we'll take some questions from the room. I think we can get the microphones down to you. We see the first hand here. You please ask direct questions, say who you are and where you're from, and direct them towards the panelists. That's going to be very helpful for me. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hans Atzpodin, I'm the Managing Director of the German Security and Defense Industries Association. My point goes back to President Niinistö's offer to have a term like security economy instead of war economy. I think the term is quite important in order to get the backing from the public and from the people who have to pay for it. And so I just wanted to contribute another offer which we brought into the discussion in the German public at the moment, which is economy of resilience. Actually, the program is almost the same like we can see it in the French environment. It's about money, it's about streamlining production for existing products, it's about recruiting, and so on and so on. But economy of resilience would be just another point. Thank you.
We were talking earlier about Finland's resilience, President Niinistö, and the sort of example.
Yes. Well, at the end, everybody, every family thinks about its own welfare, its own future. And if a strong part of that thinking consists of making sure that we can continue in security and peace, they will support the one who is increasing security. That's a basic element in democracies. We have to get our people with us. And I just saw that in France, amazing poll where youngsters said that it. And I think it's a great result. In Germany, you have good reasons to have a change.
And we have set what we call baseline. All signed up to this need to ensure that certain things function so that NATO can do its business. That the electrical grid needs to function. There needs to be sufficient supplies of food and electricity, that the transport system needs to function, because we depend on that to be able to provide deterrence and defense, and so that the population requirements don't distract their nations from the job of deterrence and defense. But what does that mean? So first we have to set these targets. We've done that. Allies have agreed to them. But second, it means that our governments and NATO as an organization need to build, and we are building, fundamentally different relationships with civilian operators, infrastructure operators, like grid operators, like critical undersea infrastructure operators, which frankly would not have been on the NATO agenda 10 years ago and weren't when Camille was there and when I was there starting there as well. So there is a fundamentally new relationship, which I think, well, for most allies, between defense and the civilian world, in particular infrastructure operators, which needs to be, in my view, institutionalized. They come to us and say, okay, we could secure our networks, our systems, in peacetime. Now, we're not so sure. And one of the things they need first and foremost is threat warnings. They don't know what they don't know, but they know something bad is out there. So when it comes to critical undersea infrastructure, for example, we have set up now networks at the strategic level and at the operational level so that a company like Equinor that's operating essential support in terms of gas and cables for the rest of Europe, they can exchange information directly with our military command to say, we see something that we think is suspicious, can you come and help? Or we can tell them, we see something, there's a Russian ship sitting over your cable or your pipeline for a little bit too long, why don't you run your capabilities to go and have a look? We never had anything like this before. So this is the sort of thing we need to do. I know the European Union is doing it very well as well. So resilience is a big thing, but it requires a whole of government approach. I think it is not flattery to say that Finland is the poster child for us in NATO. So Finland joining NATO, we immediately jumped on our Finnish colleagues and said, great, how do you do it? And we're just going to share this practice with everyone. And I started that by hiring the first Finn in NATO in a very senior position, precisely to look at these issues.
Yeah, fascinating. While I give Roberto an opportunity to come back in, can I see a show of hands? Okay, we've got two hands in the air. I will take your questions. Do you know what? I'll see if I'll come back to Roberto in a second. Let's take these two questions, sir.
Okay, I'm from Association of Polish Aviation Industry, so close to Russia. Considering the fact how urgent this situation is and how serious it is, can we still afford the Green Deal, or we can consider this as a kind of obstacle to achieve our defense or security, if you like, direct goals?
Okay, interesting question. I was struggling to hear that, but I think I've got terrible hearing. So I think what you said is, can we still afford the Green Deal when we've got these pressures on top of us? Would anyone, Roberto, you're up on screen. I'll bring you in if you'd like to answer.
Well, it's a difficult question at the moment. I mean, the Green Deal to me was a very important issue in peaceful time. Of course, now it seems the priority is different. I read somewhere that the environmental impact of the war in Ukraine is tremendous, has been computed in terms of carbon dioxide production, and it's really incredibly high. With this in mind, well, I think we should try as much as possible to stay on the roadmap for the decarbonization and continue to invest on the green transition, but invest more on peace. There's nothing to do. I mean, security, that includes also environmental security, has a big cost, and we have to be ready to pay that cost. I don't see any alternative. We have to give up with something less relevant at the moment. So making sure we have security and making sure that the Green Deal is pursued as much as possible.
Thank you so much. James and Camille both want to come in very quickly if you can.
Quickly. 3 points. One is, if you force people to choose between security or green, they're going to choose security every single time. However, there is an energy transition underway. It will happen towards more sustainable energy sources. Every NATO country is moving towards a different mix, which will include solar, in some cases energy, in some cases wind, in some cases methanol and ammonia, et cetera, and electrification. So it is happening anyway. And then coming to my Polish colleague, the challenge we have is, and you will see at the NATO summit, NATO publishing an energy transition by design. So it's not about green, it's about energy transition, which is green, but that's not the point. What we need to ensure is that through this transition that every country is making, that all NATO countries can maintain military capability and interoperability as they go to different energy mixes. So that, for me, is the biggest challenge we have through an inevitable green transition.
Before you come in, can we get the microphone down to the gentleman back there? We'll take the question just in case it's relevant and you can pick up on it as well.
Thanks a lot. My name is Burkhard Schmidt. I'm a Security and Defense Director here at ASD.
Hold the microphone a little bit closer to your face there, please.
My name is Burkhard Schmidt. I'm Security and Defense Director at ASD. What I find interesting about the term war economy is that it expresses a sense of urgency. Right? We are in a bit of a strange situation. We have a war in Europe, but Europe is not at war. And I think we see that contradiction in a certain way. But at the same time, we see also the situation in Ukraine that is quite desperate, I think, a very short term. And at the same time, I remember the German defense minister saying that there's a real risk for a war with Russia within 5 years. Mm-hmm. So there is a considerable degree of urgency. So I would just wonder whether all the things that have been discussed now, what NATO is doing, what member states have done, is that really up to speed in the light of the challenges that Ukraine and we are facing? Will we be ready within the next 5 years?
Yeah, I mean...
I can give it a shot. Maybe just adding one point to the Green Deal conversation. I think we need to recognize that security, sustainability starts with security. So we need to avoid forms of collateral damage, mostly coming from the financial sector, not from the Green Deal, that undermine our ability to invest into defense by having provisions or policies that are not enabling the defense sector to grow and invest at pace. So that's the challenge for me when it comes to that. And then I agree with James, defense can pave the way in certain domains by being at the forefront of inventing the next generation of technology that is more sustainable, that is more energy efficient and all of that. On Burkhard's point, I think indeed we have to balance between not necessarily frightening the public on the one hand, but also keeping the sense of urgency. And what we're talking about is defense economics in times of war, which is something we have not thought about for decades. So I think that's the challenge we are facing, and that is something that, how does that work in an environment? My argument is to say that this is achievable if we are serious now and we sustain it over years. So we shouldn't frighten the people on saying this is not fiscally affordable, that this is at the expense of welfare state and all of that. But nevertheless, there are major decisions to be made, and we've been indeed too slow and too fragmented in making those decisions so far.
Yeah, a final word from Eirik.
Yeah, to Mr. Burkhard's question, I think it was, we are in many countries, and we talk to governments, we talk to customers, and the speed of things, or this sense of urgency, it differs, but I still think we have a way to go, definitely. And this, I call it establishment of economy of security or economy of resilience. I think that's kind of a common theme, but how to define the threshold and activate on it. I see there's much more to go there, and so definitely. And also one comment, you mentioned Equinor, I think. I think this hybrid warfare and combining military and civilian, it's for each country it's difficult. It's a little bit new. Who take responsibility in each country? So that's another thing. But the speed needs to increase.
Yeah. I think that's an overarching understanding. Yeah, we've run out of time though. So thank you so much to all of our panelists, also to Roberto who's joined us online. A big round of applause, and come back for the next session.